Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to New York City to see a good friend who's moved to New York City from Princeton. This is Laura Kahn, and Laura is a physician, and I don't know what else you would call her, a researcher on epidemiology. And because she's a big specialist in COVID, in epidemiology and in especially in One Health, the notion that there's a connection, which we tend to overlook between our bodies and those of the animals around us. And we can share germs. So we certainly have learned a little bit about that in the last year and a half, that we have to be mindful about viruses and where they come from and how we handle them. So this is Laura's bag, and I want to have a good conversation with her about maybe what we should have learned from this experience. Okay, hi Laura.
Hi Meta, good to see you again.
Yeah, I hear you're doing, you told me you're doing a book about COVID. Well, you and about probably 100 million other people.
Oh yes, I'm sure.
You're going to have some competitors at the bookstore.
Yeah, lots of books on COVID now and in the years ahead.
What's going to be different about yours? Because obviously you have this One Health angle, right. and I think I'd like to talk about that. Really, surprisingly, I haven't had many conversations with people about COVID so far. I don't know. I guess it's because it feels like it's a moving target, the news is always good for this week or maybe next week, but not necessarily, it has no shelf life.
My book, what makes it different from the others is it's intended more for an academic audience rather than the general public, although I'm going to try and walk that fine line between making it accessible to the public and policymakers and making it accessible to physicians and public health professionals and others. So there's a real fine line, and that's generally what I try to do with my books, is span, several different audiences, if you will. So I split the book into two halves. The first half is focusing more on One Health and the scientific aspects of COVID-19, looking at coronaviruses, the history of coronaviruses, and looking at the environmental aspects of coronaviruses. Just to back up a little bit and talk briefly about One Health. It's an ancient concept, but a relatively new term. And it's generally the recognition that human, animal, plant, environmental, and ecosystem health are linked. Now, that might seem obvious to many people, and indeed for many indigenous populations, they intuitively understood that their lives were interconnected with the lives of the trees and the plants and the animals around them. But that's generally not how our institutions, our governments, businesses, academia, that's generally not how we approach these things. We focus solely on humans. So the One Health concept then requires that we expand our scope beyond just humans and looking at the entire milieu in which these viruses or other microbes, pathogens, emerge and infect humans. So just focusing on humans is really the tip of the iceberg. So the first half of my book is looking at that expansive perspective on viruses, coronaviruses specifically, and on SARS, MERS, and COVID, which are the three coronaviruses that have infected humans, the three most deadly coronaviruses. There have been others, but these are the most deadly, causing epidemics and pandemics. And then the second half of the book is going to be looking at specifically the leadership aspects of the pandemic response in various countries and specific U.S. states. So that's looking at it from the scientific perspective and then the policy leadership perspective, examining the outbreak and the response to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, first of all, I should ask a stupid question, which is, okay, we've got coronaviruses and then we've got everything else. And I never had this category in mind of a coronavirus until lately. The concept of being a class of viruses was not had never crossed my horizon, and I gathered that they are all, maybe they all sort of look alike with little spikes coming out, and are they?
That's the name, coronavirus. I mean, it's the corona of a sun, with kind of the
Oh,
rays sticking out. And that's how these viruses got their name, because under the electron micrograph, they look like they had little crowns on them, hence corona. So that's the name of coronavirus.
mhm. Well, now, are they a big section of all viruses, or is this one little nasty group of viruses among millions of other similar, other categories?
Well, I mean, it's a broad category of coronaviruses, and they've, for most of history, I mean, they were first really recognized as a new entity back in the early 1930s, when there were outbreaks in baby chicks causing a large-scale epizootic epidemic in chicks that was discovered in the Midwest, the American Midwest, and the veterinarians who discovered it recognized that it was going to look like it was a new entity, although there was some hypothesis that it might have been due to a different disease, but it developed the name infectious bronchitis in baby chicks, and it was subsequently recognized that it was indeed a new disease that the veterinarians had not seen before.
But they hadn't ever observed coronaviruses as a special looking critter before.
Well,
They thought, when you say it was like new, surely there are no. It would a coronavirus has presumably have been around since prehistoric times.
Oh, sure. I mean, coronaviruses are an ancient lineage, but
Yeah.
human recognition of them didn't start until the early 1930s. That they recognized that this disease that was killing baby chicks was something that they hadn't seen before.
And what would they all, in terms of symptoms, do they all have certain symptoms in common, or what?
Yeah, so they had this unusual, they appeared to be drowning in their own fluids, really. The thought was that it was going to be inflammation, kind of your standard disease. There was this bird disease called laryngeotracheitis, where they would get inflammation. But this was different because when they were doing the necropsies, which are the animal equivalent autopsies on birds, their lungs were filled with fluid. And it was just a completely different picture than what they were expecting.
Now, were any of those contagious to people, or?
No, they were not. They were not. They were a veterinary disease. They were not zoonotic. So that's an important point. So up until SARS, really the only deadly coronaviruses were all purely veterinary. So the assumption was that these viruses do not really cause disease in humans. There were a couple cases of simple upper respiratory tract infections, colds, in humans that they identified in the 1960s. In some medical students, for example, they identified cold virus, or it caused the common cold. And the thinking was, up until SARS, that coronaviruses just didn't cause severe disease in humans. Now, these viruses, though, were very notable for jumping different species, and they were infecting many different species, including lots of different birds. They were infecting, turkeys and other poultry. And now you have to also realize that the only animals that were getting surveillance were livestock and occasionally companion animals. We weren't looking at wildlife before SARS. So we did recognize then that coronaviruses were infecting livestock, and most notably pigs. Pigs were getting infected quite a bit by the coronaviruses. Porcine.
There was something called swine flu at one point.
That's different. That's different. It's an influenza virus.
Oh.
If it's a flu, it's a different virus.
Uh-huh. So from the symptoms, you couldn't guess necessarily whether what you have caught is a coronavirus or something else. Different critters, like different types of viruses, could all similar symptoms that resemble each other.
Right. If you get an upper respiratory tract infection, it can be due to a number of different viruses. It can be due to your common rhinovirus, the cold virus, an adenovirus, a coronavirus. There's different viruses that cause the common cold. And there's many different types of rhinoviruses, for example. So yeah, in most cases, they're generally mild, self-limited diseases that, spread through, somebody coughing near you or, what have you. Respiratory tract infections generally are spread through fairly close contact or infected fomites, objects like doorknobs or shopping cart handles that don't get cleaned, things like that. And then you touch your eye and you can, infect yourself. So,
well, that's the kind of thing we were being told early on in the epidemic. Be very careful to wash your hands and don't touch things. And
right. So interestingly enough, for both SARS and MERS, if you look at how they spread, now they were not as communicable as COVID-19. So SARS was primarily droplet spread, and only people who were very sick and very symptomatic were contagious. And you had some people who were super spreaders, like there was an example at the Metropole Hotel, I believe that was in Hong Kong, where a sick doctor just infected a lot of people who were around him waiting for the elevator, for example. He was very symptomatic and he super spread to people who then went back to their home countries and helped spread that. And MERS similarly also only spread through very sick, very symptomatic individuals. There were a few super spreading events, particularly in South Korea. And so they did not cause the type of pandemic that we're seeing with COVID. But nevertheless, when COVID appeared, there was the general assumption that it was going to act like SARS and MERS, where only the most sick and contagious people would be spreading. But that was not, in fact, the case. There were a lot of people who had no symptoms at all, but who were infectious. And there wasn't appreciated by the public health community that this was an airborne virus, meaning that it can stay airborne in a room. So you can walk into a room, there could be nobody in the room, but the virus could be floating around in the room because somebody who had been sick was in there. This is like measles, one of the most communicable diseases around. Mm-hmm. You can walk into a room where somebody who had measles like an hour or two ago, you walk in and you're exposed because it's floating around in the room. So that's very different from what we saw with SARS and MERS. So the whole, public health kind of dropped the ball because they made an assumption that just wasn't true. So they told people that you don't really need a mask if you're, doing your daily thing, because really only the most infectious people were those who were the most symptomatic people were those who were the most contagious. You don't really have to worry, other than inadvertently perhaps touching, an object that's infected. That's very common with the flu.
So there was a good rationale for telling people they didn't need to wear masks.
That's right.
I had heard that it was really mostly that there was such a shortage of the super masks.
That was the other motive for telling people they didn't need to wear masks, was because there was a shortage. And they wanted to save the masks for the healthcare workers who were going to be having the closest contact to the sickest, presumably most infectious people. So there was method to their rationale, and it was applicable to SARS and MERS. It just didn't apply to COVID-19.
Would it have made any difference in the the history of the disease if early on we'd all said let's wear masks? If we had started doing that, and instead of paying attention, for a long time when I brought in my mail or my groceries, I put it on the kitchen sink and I sprayed it with bleach and I left it there for 2 or 3 days before I'd even touch it again. Well, I was obviously overly preoccupied with that kind of contact, but
Right.
wearing a mask was not part
Yeah.
of the game.
Yeah, no, we would have been much better off if we had all been wearing masks very early on.
It would have slowed it, and
It would have helped us slow the spread, certainly. But,
Mhm.
we didn't know. And again, the assumption was that this virus was acting more like SARS and MERS.
Okay. Okay, tell me more about where you're going with your book about the zoonotic.
Mhm.
Yeah, okay.
Well, the chapter that I'm working on right now, the environmental aspects, I mean, that's huge because when we talk about the environment, we can talk about outdoors or indoors. I mean, there's different environments, and as we've seen, being outdoors with wind, for example, there's going to be less risk for becoming infected than if you're in an enclosed space indoors, where the virus can linger and pose more of a problem.
I
So
gather there's a huge difference that outdoors, you're almost totally safe outdoors, but you certainly aren't inside that.
right. So there's this concept called R naught, R with a little zero underneath it. R naught, it represents a useful quantity. It's the number of individuals that one sick person will infect.
Oh,
So and R naught is usually measured at the beginning of an outbreak. So, and then of course it's influenced by the population at hand, how many people are susceptible, and it's influenced by the environment, whether you're outdoors or indoors. So, just to give you an example, measles, which is one of the most contagious viruses around, its R naught has been estimated to be in a completely unvaccinated population. Its R naught is estimated to be somewhere between 12 and 18. So
oh.
one sick person can infect 12 to 18 people, and that of course varies by the population and the environment in which they
Is
are.
that an average, or when you said a person could infect that many? Surely you after you hit 18, you don't run out of stuff. If you happen to be in a really bad situation, you could infect maybe 50, right?
Sure. I mean, a super spreading event, you can infect a whole auditorium full of people. Absolutely. We're just talking about averages here. You're taking data collected during an outbreak and trying to make a summary statistic that can inform people about, how contagious this disease is. So SARS, and of course the numbers vary, which is making what's writing this chapter a challenge. The SARS R naught was somewhere between 2 and 3, but it varies again depending on whether you're dealing with a super spreading event. I mean, some people are just more infectious and generate more secretions than other people. So we're just talking about averages. And similarly with MERS, also somewhere between 2 and 3, although I've seen some reports of like 0.69 or in some reports 8. So, you've got this broad range. But in general, if your R naught is less than 1, meaning that one sick person will infect less than one individual, then your outbreak is going to die out. But if your number is greater than 1, meaning that one sick person is going to infect at least 2 people, well, then you're going to have this propagation. So the goal then of public health is to get R naught to be less than 1 so that the outbreak peters out. That's the goal. And there's a variety of different strategies to get R naught less than 1 to break that chain of transmission. And that includes, social distancing, contact tracing, your bread and butter public health, quarantining the healthy who are potentially exposed, isolating the sick who are potentially can spread it, a whole variety of strategies. And of course, one of the best strategies is vaccination, where you make the person immune.
Mhm.
So then you no longer have a completely susceptible population and the chain of transmission is broken.
What's the R naught for COVID?
Well, that's what I'm studying now because, there are numbers all over the place. So trying to figure out what exactly was, and of course it varies depending on the location and the population and whether there were super spreading events. So there's all sorts of contingencies, but it is almost certainly higher than SARS and MERS, but by how much and taking into account the super spreading events, I mean, those numbers are very hard to come by and you see the literature kind of all over the place. So that's what I'm trying to figure out, how they compare between, I mean, just through observation, you can argue that yes, COVID's going to have a much higher R naught than SARS and MERS, but by how much? And that's kind of a big question there.
Well, also from what I hear in the press, the different variants would have different R naughts.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And
So some of the variants are more contagious than your initial virus.
Yeah. Now that leads me to a question of a video that I saw maybe 2 or 3 months ago. Some guy said that the situation is one that would very greatly favor the development of new and more dangerous variants, because if you only have partial immunity, that's a wonderful situation for evolution to take place in, because you have a situation where you have a competition for the survival of the fittest. The time between the first shot and the second shot would be a time when you're partially immune, and therefore we're creating millions, if not billions, of people who are a perfect evolutionary terrain for the emergence of worse and worse variants.
Well, I think the greater risk, rather than individuals between their shots, are the individuals who refuse to get any shots at all, because the longer you have people who are unvaccinated, those are the susceptibles, and they are the ones that are going to be the ones most likely to have viral evolution, particularly people who are in some ways immunosuppressed. And I've seen some reports where people get prolonged COVID infections. Their body just can't clear the virus. And so the virus has lots of opportunities to evolve, mutate inside their bodies. So I think that's a much greater, difficulty in dealing with this than, the people who are between their shots, because you will get some immunity with the first shot, obviously not as much as those who have gotten the second, but it's the people who have a natural vulnerability through various reasons of immunosuppression. And there's a whole slew of them. I mean, we have lots of people who are living with immunosuppression, and they are kind of like, extremely vulnerable to having a long-term infection that they can't clear.
Well, are there any people who would have, without taking a vaccine, who would naturally be immune?
Well, look, the people who are not having any symptoms with infection, they have certainly a high level of immunity. Also, for people who are younger with a more robust immune system in general, they were less inclined to get sick, although they could have been infectious. We saw with this virus that mortality increased with age, and your immune system doesn't work as well with age, particularly after age 65. So the mortality rates really started to pick up after age 65 in most of the populations.
Mhm.
So they are naturally immunosuppressed through something as simple as age. And then you've got the different comorbidities, whether you've got high blood pressure or you're obese or you have some chronic disease that, again, is going to impact your ability to fight off the virus.
This Delta thing is worse, right? And
Right. Well, I mean, it appears to be deadlier and more communicable, but again, that fortunately, it appears that those who are fully vaccinated are protected against it. So that's the good news. Look, we're dealing with active biological agents. They're technically not alive because they don't do the things that they can't reproduce by themselves. They are parasites and they need host cells in order to replicate. So for being technically not alive, they're they're good at getting around and, wrecking havoc.
is a virus a living thing or not? And
Right.
what you just said is basically you think they're not.
That's
Well,
right.
what is life then?
Well, what's our criteria for life? Well, usually it's something that eats, eliminates, and reproduces by itself. And a virus doesn't do any of those things. They don't eat, they don't eliminate, and they don't reproduce by themselves. So they're technically not alive. They are a piece of genetic material surrounded by a protein coat in most cases. And they get around through people expelling them from their bodies or animals or whatever. They get around through sneezing, coughing, diarrhea. Somehow they cause your body to expel them so that they get into the environment and can travel to the next host. And they're very good at that. We're very good at sneezing and coughing and vomiting or whatever to get this virus out of our bodies, and that's their goal, and that's what they want you to do. So our strategy then is to thwart them in whatever means we can, whether it's through personal protective equipment or making sure our water isn't contaminated or just isolating ourselves to keep us from expelling the virus into somebody else.
Okay, suppose we all did a perfect job and we wore masks and we washed and we kept our distance and we did everything. And really, there's nobody left on the planet with the virus.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is it really gone, or is there some animal still harboring the thing and the same little critter is going to jump out at us, somebody else later? Could we ever, in theory, get rid of it completely?
That's a great question because that's the whole nature of zoonotic diseases. Now, one of the reasons we were able to eradicate smallpox was because there was no animal reservoir. So because there was no animal reservoir, you vaccinate all the humans and voila, smallpox has been eradicated from Earth and only exists in a couple freezers in some government laboratories. Hopefully nobody resurrects them. That's the whole concern with bioterrorism. But with coronaviruses, we do have a very large animal reservoir, and that's bats. Bats have been found to harbor many coronaviruses, and they were the reservoir host species for SARS and MERS. We saw the chain of transmission from bat to civet cat to human in the case of SARS, and from bat to camel to human in the case of MERS. In COVID, in contrast, we've seen bat, we have not found that intermediate animal host. And the key question then is, well, how did it get from bat to human? Was there an intermediate animal host? Did it go straight from bat to human? Or did it go from bat to laboratory to human? Mm-hmm. That's the huge, $1 million question that we're all trying to figure out, was how did it get from the bat into the human so that we can develop better, preventive strategies going
forward. Do you really know that this particular COVID virus was originally and still exists among bats? Or is it that that coronaviruses in general live among bats, and probably therefore this one does too. Or is it possible? I mean, people speculate that this was something like engineered in this lab in Wuhan, and that it doesn't exist in a bat population as such. But if that would be lovely to know, because that presumably means that if you could stamp it out among people, that would be game over, right? It wouldn't.
Game over for this. It wouldn't be game over for coronaviruses in general. We've entered the coronavirus era. I mean, a lot of our practices have helped to promote the emergence of these zoonotic diseases through, I can list them, deforestation, the capture of wildlife and the consumption of wild animals that harbor some of these viruses. I mean, many of the activities that we do promote the emergence of these zoonotic diseases, and we're only going to see more of them as time goes on. So that process is ongoing. The question then is this virus from a laboratory? Was it genetically engineered? And that's the big controversy that's been going on. Mm-hmm. As I said, it's different from SARS and MERS in that it's far more communicable from the very beginning. We did not find an intermediate animal host. So there are circumstantial evidence, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology was established in response to SARS to study coronaviruses. I mean, that was the whole reason why it was established, was to try to study these viruses. Mm-hmm. Now, you've got this whole controversy of, the research that they were doing. Did it involve gain of function research? Gain
of function research.
Right. So back in 2004, the National Academy of Sciences listed in a report, Biotechnology Research in an Age of Terrorism, these 7 experiments of concern that should not be done. These 7 experiments of concern included things like making a virus deadlier, making a virus more transmissible, making a virus be able to infect more host species, making a virus be able to evade diagnostic tests, or making it be able to evade a vaccine, to weaponize the virus. All these things are experiments that should not be done. Now, those all make sense, but they weren't listened to. And indeed, there are experiments that some of us, myself included, consider are unethical, that should not be done. Why make Mother Nature's very good at making deadly viruses? Why should we help her? But their argument is, well, we need to develop this deadly virus so that if we see one, we'll know it when we see it, which to me really makes no sense. But, you've got these scientists who really want to make a name for themselves and push the envelope and, and on and on. So gain of function research is one of these experiments of concern where you give the virus capabilities that the virus didn't necessarily already have. Now, that's not to condemn all of gain of function research, because there is some that is actually useful. And that, for example, is to insert the insulin gene into bacteria, where the bacteria then can make insulin for diabetics. So that's, the bacteria don't normally produce insulin, but that's a gain of function. We gave them that capability to make insulin. And, now you've got this, great production system of insulin for diabetics. So that's a gain of function that one could argue is highly ethical. Mm-hmm. But the gain of function of dealing with deadly microbes like viruses, like coronaviruses, do we really want to give them added capabilities in the sake of science to see, what public health threat that might pose? No, but yet it's been funded. And they argue.
Oh, really? So that it's going on because there are actual funding things that have been proposed and approved.
Absolutely. It's been approved, it's been funded, and this research has been done. It's very, very controversial.
And is it in every country, or do certain countries refuse to do it?
Well, the US government has been funding some of this research. Back in 2011, for example, there was research being done on H5N1 influenza, which is a very deadly virus, but not that communicable. And what the researchers were doing was trying to make it airborne between ferrets. They were, pushing the virus. They had two ferrets in two separate cages and trying to make the virus jump from ferret to ferret through a method that it ordinarily doesn't do. And they did this multiple times until the virus got that capability. And it generated huge outrage. What are you doing? Why are you doing this experiment? This was being done in Wisconsin and in the Netherlands. And I actually wrote an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist saying, the scientists are like Icarus flying close to the sun. They've got this incredible hubris thinking, they're doing this for fame and glory, but yet, their wings are going to melt someday.
Yeah.
And I wrote an article just a couple weeks ago saying our luck has run out because, if this is indeed gain of function research, and we don't know, and we likely never will know, but if it were, this is what it would look like. This virus doesn't act like SARS or MERS. There's no intermediate animal host. And there are some things about the virus itself in the spike protein that the other two viruses didn't have. And it's called a furin cleavage site, which is, something that just didn't exist in SARS and MERS, but makes it very communicable to humans.
And you think maybe somebody put it there?
Yeah, so some people, myself included, think that somebody put it there.
Okay, so now you've declared which side of the debate you're on.
What side. Yeah, and to be honest, very early on, I felt that this is just not acting like SARS and MERS. Now, that's not to say that coronaviruses cannot be explosively contagious, because we've seen it in the animal world, where you do have explosively contagious airborne transmission among pigs, for example, but we didn't see it among humans the way we didn't see it with SARS and MERS the way we are with COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
So there were just.
Well, I have to say, I, an uninformed person, had my own doubts and harbored them through the time when I was told that that's not realistic. That, on the basis of just probability, why would this thing happen, a few miles from the center of the research on this kind of phenomenon? Why, of all places in the world, would it happen by coincidence right there? Right. And by the way, what do pangolins have to do with it?
There was some thought that the pangolins might have been the intermediate animal host, but that didn't pan out. But look, the Wuhan Institute, there were reports of poor biosafety practices. So like I said, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that it was indeed from the lab, but we don't have confirmative proof. So,
well, if you get it, do you think you'll ever, or it's even possible to get evidence, proof, one way or the other? And if so, what would be the global policy implications? What would happen if we really showed, somebody really proved that it was done in the lab?
Right.
What would happen then?
Well, I think it's important to point out that no lab is infallible to error. Laboratory accidents happen all the time. Placing blame. I mean, this was an accident. I mean, I don't think the Chinese certainly wanted to infect their own population. So it's clearly an accident if it is indeed from the laboratory. And that having been said, there are cases of outbreaks happening from laboratory accidents. There was an outbreak of foot and mouth disease from the Pirbright laboratory in England, for example. And there's been other outbreaks of SARS from a Chinese lab. So these things happen. There is, unfortunately, no oversight of laboratory-acquired infections. There is no surveillance systems in place, not in the United States and not on an international basis. I can't speak for country by country. Maybe there are some countries out there that do conduct surveillance on laboratory-acquired infections, but it's not done in the United States. The CDC doesn't do it because it is a work-related infection, and the National Institute of Occupational Health and Safety don't do it because it involves a biological agent. So it kind of falls through the cracks between the CDC and NIOSH in that CDC deals with biological agents but not work-related, and NIOSH deals with work-related but not biological. so it just doesn't get done. So we don't have that, for example. And the most important thing, though, is this whole oversight of biotech research. The fact that gain-of-function research is approved and funded and done. The scientists have shown that they're not very good at policing themselves. In response to this pandemic, they rallied around and insisted that it wasn't laboratory acquired, even though we don't have all the data. We don't have, there's a whole field of biomedical ethics that deals with human subject research. We don't have a field of biomedical research ethics that deals with laboratory research. The expertise strictly involves human subjects, not microbes. So that's a huge gap that we're missing.
Okay, but look, if Laura Kahn wrote to Congress and said, pass a law saying outlawing any gain of function research. Now, you're not going to do that because you see that sometimes insulin, et cetera, is a good outcome.
There are legitimate uses for gain of function research.
Yeah.
We don't want to outlaw it, point blank, because there are some very legitimate uses for it. But I think we need to be much stricter in implementing the National Academy of Sciences recommendations of the 7 experiments of concern that should not be done. I think Congress should pass a law establishing a commission to investigate. They did this in regards to human subject research, by the way, where the commission issued a report that helped to establish the whole field of biomedical ethics. But again, this was strictly involved and this was in response to the outrage of the Tuskegee experiments, where they were infecting poor Black men with syphilis and not treating them. There was tremendous outrage, and appropriately so. And so they responded in kind to making sure that there was strict oversight for any experiment being done on human subjects, that it be ethical. We need to have an equivalent process and mechanism in place for biotechnology research involving dangerous pathogens like viruses, like coronaviruses or bacteria.
Is there any movement to that effect? Or are you a lonely voice in the wilderness?
I think I'm one of the few who's raising this issue at this point. I think people right now are still focused on whether or not this came from a lab or not. But what I'm saying is we need to start thinking about what if this is from such an event. These experiments are unethical, and we really need to have better oversight than what's currently being done. It's not an effective system moving forward.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think you should be the leader of the movement then.
Oh, thanks.
I like movements. I'm a sort of a social movement person, so I'm always looking for partners. And if I can join yours, I will.
Oh, thanks. Well,
now
yeah.
You said that the second half of your book is about how the management of the epidemic went. Tell me what you think about how it was managed in different places.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't started researching or writing that book. All I can tell you is my observations living in the United States. That, I wrote the book, Who's in Charge? Leadership During Epidemics, Bioterror Attacks, and Other Public Health Crises. That came out in 2009, long before COVID-19, looking from a historical perspective of how different political leaders and public health leaders responded to different epidemics or other public health crises. I wrote a preface to that book and reissued it in June 2020, looking at comparing the leadership of Xi Jinping of China with Donald Trump of the United States, looking at how they have responded so far. And the interesting thing, and I in the first book, I developed a model of public health leadership looking at the relationship between the political and public health leaders and the relationships that they may or may not have and how that can influence outcomes. And so I intend to, in the book, look at the relationship of the political, because all public health crises are political events. The severity of the crisis dictates then how political it becomes. And as you can imagine, COVID-19 is a highly political event. So the impact on that relationship is enormous. And so that's what I plan to study, but I'm still on R0 with SARS and MERS and COVID and have not gotten yet to that second part of the book.
Okay, but look, I think it's a totally different line of inquiry, because looks to me like you've got to do something like psychoanalytic theorizing or something to explain the damn thing. There's no reason why being right wing should make you less fearful of viruses than people like me. That is just plain goofy. And yet, consistently all around the world, these nutcase leaders like Bolsonaro and all of these other folks seem to be the ones. The right-wing leaders seem to be the ones who say, "Don't worry about it. Go ahead. It's only a virus. It won't hurt you." And that, to me, not only does it call for an inquiry into the thinking of the political figures, but also of ordinary citizens, because I don't think, if you did a study of Democrats and Republicans, and you compared how many of them get their flu shots every year, or have their babies vaccinated for measles and diphtheria and stuff, I bet you wouldn't find much difference. So why is it here now that this kind of politicization and polarization has occurred? To me, it calls for, I think, I've just been in despair about the mentality of the whole population. How can you run a democracy when you have people, the 40% of the population, that crazy?
Well, I agree. We've got a lot of challenges, and we could spend another several hours discussing this because there's so many facets to it. But I think, the key issue that we need to get across is, in order for any government, any leader to be successful, is you need to have public trust. You need to be transparent, you need to be honest, and you need to have the trust of your population in order for them to follow the policies that you're recommending.
Now, wait a minute. Do you think that Xi is followed? I don't think people probably believe Xi, but they certainly obey him.
Well,
and is that trust? I don't know whether that's trust.
That's not a democracy. We're talking about.
Well, all right, but yeah, but he's successful. I mean, maybe. Oh, well, then the corollary is, therefore, let's get rid of democracy and try to act like Xi.
No, I'm not recommending that at all, because I don't think the Chinese are being well served necessarily by an authoritarian government. You ideally want to have political leaders who are accountable to the people they are meant to protect and serve, right? So you
Theoretically, but if the people they're trying to protect and serve are as crazy and stupid as the populations of some of these countries, then you don't want that. You want to save them no matter, even against their wishes.
Well, I mean, I think people need to realize that who you elect matters, who you vote for matters.
Yes,
You want to
it
have
does.
somebody who actually believes in science, who listens to expertise, and who has the well-being of the population as their top priority.
I agree, but suppose people don't recognize that. How are you going to convince them? They're resisting that idea.
That is a challenge, because if you deal with people who are, stoking flames of hatred of others, or raising fears or fear mongering, during a period of great social unrest, large, vast income inequality, it kind of sets the population up for being fed or told what they want to hear. Those are all challenges that have to be overcome if we want to have a functioning democracy. We also have to have, the US has a caste system based on skin color. That's it's original sin of the country. And that's certainly hindering the politics of our country as well. So all of those things in the United States are challenges that the public needs to address, and to make sure that everybody has a voice and has a vote, so that the most qualified people become the elected leaders, the ones in charge during such a crisis as a pandemic, because who you elect can mean the difference between your life or death. It is that important, as we've seen during COVID-19. So that having been said, when you have political leaders who are more concerned about their own reelection, or are more concerned about business, their income, lining their pockets, who are corrupt, they are not going to be effective leaders as somebody who's actually honest, trustworthy, and cares about the health and well-being of the people they were elected to represent. So those are, I think, really important factors that we have to look at moving forward.
Okay, I'm a political sociologist, and my research has sometimes been about right-wing politics, extremism. So understanding how this works is supposed to be my job, and it is not one in which I have any success whatever. Right now, I think, it's really a matter of explaining how a whole population can go crazy together, just as, they did when, Hitler came to power. He was elected democratically by the German population, okay. Now, when you have that possibility, there's a problem. And I don't think anybody's got that solved yet. It really worries me. And how it affected the epidemic is certainly a good part of it. But I don't think anybody, I've got some angles on which are the really relevant factors and which are not, but none of them are really things that we can do anything about. I don't see any variable that you or I or anybody I know could really influence much that would turn the population's public opinion around.
Well, that's where the role of education is. We really need to have a strong educational system that teaches people how to think critically, and to learn about the history of, the country, all of its warts and ugliness, and not hide it, because really the only hope that we have is through education, to have a population that understands how their government is supposed to work. So they have to learn civics. They have to understand science.
Laura, if that's true, we're sunk. We can't make them do it.
Yeah. Well, again, these are political issues, and we've got to fight like heck to make sure that everybody's got a right to vote, and hopefully elect people who actually care about the public. and not, their own self-interest.
Well, you and I have the same aspirations and the same values, but I'm much more discouraged than I think you are.
Well,
But I don't think that any of the measures I know to do have any leverage. And I just don't know where to go with this. And I've looked as much of the variables as I can, and I don't know.
well, Meta, I don't think we can be nihilistic in this. I think we need to be, politically active and make sure that the forces of justice and equity and, predominate over those that try to suppress freedom, justice, and the will of the people.
Okay.
What other alternative do we have? I mean,
Okay, right.
democracy is the best system that we've had. I mean, nobody wants to live under an autocracy or an oligarchy, or where you have no say whatsoever in, the decisions at the very top of government.
The information about the response in Russia now kind of corroborates your point of view, which is that, I've talked to yesterday, 2 days ago, I did an interview largely about Russia, and something like 80% of the population now are refusing to be vaccinated. It's not even it's not on the same order of magnitude as in other countries. And the explanation is people basically say, the government lies to me all the time. I don't believe a word they say. And Putin, and maybe in particular, but maybe not just Putin. The government tells us things that are not true. So if they tell you to do something, you're better off not doing it.
Yeah. And that's what you get when you have a government that is not of, by, and for the people. And the public know that. I mean, that's what helped bring down the Soviet Union is, all the lies behind Chernobyl.
Yeah, but it may also do us in before they, okay, we're going in circles now. And this has been fun, but not enjoyable. It's been enjoyable, but not fun.
The topic, unfortunately, is not. Look, when you have somebody like me on to interview, I'm dealing with pandemics. It's not going to be a uplifting subject, unfortunately. We live in a microbial world. We need to learn how to live in it more sustainably. We need to learn how to live in it better. And, so that should be an incentive for all governments to make sure that they ensure that their publics can be as healthy as possible, given the circumstances, given the planet that we're on. That's a tall order, but look, we've got to just keep striving. And that's part of the goal of One Health, is recognizing that our health is part of the planet. We're part of nature, and we need to recognize that if we want to have a more sustainable future.
I salute you for carrying on, despite what may sometimes, I guess, be a hard thing to keep going. Yeah, is it?
Yes. It's hard not to be nihilistic at times, but
Well, look, I'm looking forward to your book, so hurry up. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Take care.
My pleasure. Thank you, Meta.
Okay. Bye, Laura.
Bye-bye.